Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, higher than I, higher than I. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I. You're my tower against the foe. Hear my cry, O God, answer my prayer, answer my prayer, answer my prayer. Hear my cry, O God, answer my prayer. You're my tower against the foe. Lead me to the rock, lead me to the rock that is higher than I, higher than I, higher than I, higher than I. Lead me to the rock, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. You're my tower against the foe. I'll fulfill my vows day after day, day after day, day after day. I'll fulfill my vows day after day. You're my tower against the foe. Lead me to the rock, lead me to the rock that is higher than I, higher than I, higher than I, higher than I. Lead me to the rock, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. You're my tower against the foe. I'll take refuge in the shelter of your wings, the shelter of your wings, the shelter of your wings. I'll take refuge in the shelter of your wings. You're my tower against the foe. Lead me to the rock, lead me to the rock that is higher than I, higher than I, higher than I, higher than I, higher than I. Lead me to the rock, lead me to the rock that is higher than I. You're my tower against the foe. You're my tower against the foe. You're my tower against the foe.
Kia ora. Thanks for joining us online this morning. We'll be reading from Matthew chapter 8. I'm sure we're all adjusting to life at level 2. We've been in lockdown for quite a while, and maybe this is what Noah and his family felt like coming out of the ark, figuring out how to carry on life under the new normal, what we can and can't do. But what we do know is we're able to meet in groups of 10 for a while. So hopefully you're able to have some fellowship this morning with your brothers and sisters. This month we've been studying how to have hope through the storm. And we'll continue that this morning by looking at a story from Matthew chapter 8, verse 23. It says, "Then he got into the boat and his disciples followed him. Suddenly a furious storm came up on the lake so that the wave swept over the boat, but Jesus was sleeping. The disciples went and woke him, saying, 'Lord, save us, we're going to drown.' He replied, 'You of little faith, why are you so afraid?' Then he got up and rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. The men were amazed and asked, 'What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him.'" This is a great story, and the context is Jesus has just finished preaching the Sermon on the Mount. And so chapter 8 begins with him healing a man with leprosy. Next, he heals the centurion's servant. Then he heals Peter's mother-in-law. Soon, everyone who is sick and demon-possessed come to Jesus for healing. Even more people gather in verse 18 so that he wants to get away and retreat and get some rest. Before he does, 2 more people come and ask him questions. And then in verse 23, finally, he gets in the boat with his disciples and he is exhausted. And so from this story, let's look at a few points this morning about how we can have hope during the storm. First of all, what kind of man is this? The disciples actually asked this question at the end of the story. They've been with Jesus for a little while now and seen him do amazing things, but this is next level. In other words, he's clearly not human. This is a group of grown men, some who are very familiar with seas and storms, and they think they're about to die. And the NIV says drown, but it literally says we're going to perish. This is a serious storm, and there's no hope in sight. And we need to wake up Jesus or we're going to die. And when they do, they get a rebuke and a miracle. Matthew is writing to this Jewish audience, highlighting who Jesus is. That's like today, many people are curious about who Jesus really is. And so for Jews, there are plenty of examples in the Old Testament of God demonstrating his power over water. In fact, the major event in the Old Testament involves God and water, the Exodus. As Israel leaves Egypt, there's water in front of them and an army behind them. And they're terrified and cry out to the Lord, "It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert." I mean, that's similar to the disciples in the boat. They're terrified and think they're going to die. But it's at this point God shows up. He splits the ocean in half. Israel walks through it safely, and then the water returns and wipes out the entire Egyptian army. And as a result, Israel puts their trust in God. And so Matthew's connecting the dots for his audience. Remember when Israel was trapped and in a hopeless situation, and God showed up and demonstrated his power over water, and Israel said, "We're going to serve God"? Well, that's who this is. It's the same God. It's God in the flesh demonstrating his power. That's what kind of man this is, God. In this chapter alone, he showed he has power over storms, power over sickness, and power over spirits. And specifically, if you really think about Jesus and his power over sickness, it's really impressive. For the first 17 verses of chapter 8, all he does is heal people. He's pouring himself out so much he needs to take a break. Because of the ministry Jesus had, healing the sick and taking care of the sick, St. Basil founded the first Christian hospital in 369 AD. Medicine and doctors existed prior to this time. However, what we think of as a hospital hadn't fully developed yet. And so after Basil makes this hospital, for the next 1,000 years, Christian hospitals spread through the East and the West. By the 6th century, the Roman Empire required hospitals be attached to the churches that were being built. And so the church was the main provider of health care in poor villages. And eventually, those would transform into the modern day hospital. And so think about it, across the globe, right now, think about how hard and how integral the hospitals and the hospital workers have been. They're on the front lines battling COVID. And they've been such an essential part of combating this crisis. And the hospital owes its very existence to Jesus, demonstrating his power over sickness. And the disciples ask, "What kind of man is this?" And Matthew answers, he's God in the flesh. He has the power to heal sickness. He has the power to calm storms. And he has the power to cast out spirits. Therefore, this man is truly a man worth following. That's our second point this morning, a man worth following. Right before the disciples get into the boat, Jesus is met by two people who didn't get into the boat. One is overeager and the other not eager enough. "Teacher, I'll follow you wherever you go, unless it's that boat." Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple said to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." And both of these guys may have been well-meaning, but clearly didn't understand the demands of following Jesus. Similar today, right? People expressed interest in following Jesus, but that doesn't equal discipleship. That's simply mild interest. In contrast, the same guys that he called 4 chapters earlier, get in this boat and experience the storm and also the miracle. Earlier in Jesus' ministry, they left their nets immediately and followed him. They've demonstrated what it meant to follow Jesus initially, and they're still following. But now, in this storm and in this boat, their minds are blown about who Jesus really is. What kind of man is this? He's clearly not human, but he's definitely worth following. YouTube is the most searched website with over 1 billion users. And people subscribe to different channels and start to follow those channels. And the channels with the most followers are as follows. At number 10, Dude Perfect, 50 million subscribers. There's 5 guys doing sports tricks, and they're a lot of fun. At number 5 is the 5-Minute Crafts, 64 million subscribers. A variety of, crafts. And number 1, the number 1 YouTube channel is called T-Series, 139 million subscribers. And this channel is for Indian music. So think about it. 3 of the top 10 YouTube channels deal with sports, crafts, and music, with over 250 million following these channels. Don't get me wrong, I too want to learn about cool trick shots and crafts and listen to Indian music, but following these channels with all my heart and all my soul and all my mind really isn't worth it. And the point is, everybody is really following something. You may not subscribe to those channels, but you do subscribe to something in life. There are things in our life we believe are worth following, and we give ourselves over to those things. And the Bible makes this case that you're either following the one true God or you're following an assortment of false gods. Even the chosen people of God, Israel, constantly struggled with following other gods. And all those YouTube channels are cool, by the way, but they do zero for your eternal well-being. In fact, they actually take time from your life, whereas Jesus adds eternity to your life. Those channels aren't willing to die for you, but they're dying to take your time and your money. Matthew, the writer, is saying to his audience, this guy is worth following. He's the real deal. And to anybody reading this text, it's saying stop following and investing and idolizing things that are created and follow the Creator. If you're a disciple of Jesus and you think, I follow Jesus wholeheartedly without question, I want you to take a moment to consider the majority of Israel's history was deeply entrenched with idolatry. In fact, it took centuries and an exile for God to cleanse them of following false gods. So don't be too quick to overestimate your discipleship and assume that you're unique and immune to idolatry. So ask your brothers and sisters what they think your top priority is. Is there something you're following more eagerly than following Jesus? And if you're watching this morning and you're skeptical about Jesus, I want to challenge you to try and follow his teachings for 1 month. He explicitly says when you try and save your life, you will lose it. Yet when you lose your life for him, you'll save it. I'm sure you've experienced the emptiness that following false gods brings, and I'm sure you've thought something or someone would bring contentment only to be disappointed. However, Jesus is a man worth following. Or if you're young and looking for something radical to get involved in, I challenge you to follow the teachings of Jesus for 1 month. We have teens in our own fellowship that are living this life and looking for other young men and other young women to be radical alongside of them. And if you don't fit into any of those categories, I still challenge you to investigate who this guy Jesus really is. Spend time reading the gospel, or watch our online church services for 1 month, or ask someone to teach you more about Jesus, because he is a man worth following. Lastly, Jesus is a man worth staying awake for. In the most chaotic moment, Jesus is fast asleep. His disciples are fearing for their lives. Jesus is not overwhelmed. Jesus is not troubled. He is at peace. But later in Jesus' life, this very scene will be reversed. In Matthew chapter 26, verse 37, Jesus takes Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him, and he began to be sorrowful and troubled. And he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." And Jesus goes away and prays, and he comes back, and his disciples have gone to sleep. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus is overwhelmed, and he's troubled to the point of death. In the midst of his greatest storm, his disciples fall asleep. In less than 24 hours, Jesus will be crucified. And this passage continues in verse 40. Then he returned to his disciples and found them sleeping. "Couldn't you keep watch with me for 1 hour?" he asked Peter. And these guys failed to recognize the significance of this moment. They couldn't stay awake for the man who saved them in the storm. They couldn't stay awake for the man who was about to die so they could live. And look, I get it. Sometimes it is simply hard to stay awake. If you've ever taken a long trip and been the driver, you've battled to stay awake. When I lived in the U.S., I once drove 7 hours one way to a funeral for a mate's mom. I attended the funeral, I spent time with the family after the funeral, and then I drove back home another 7 hours. And on the way home, I did everything possible to stay awake. I rolled the windows down, I rolled the windows up. I turned the heat on full blast. I turned the aircon on full blast. I turned the radio full blast. I sang at the top of my lungs. I stopped and did push-ups. I stopped and ran around the car. I stopped and ran in place. I felt like Mr. Bean trying to stay awake in church. It was really hard to stay awake. And as we age spiritually, sometimes it is hard to stay awake. And it's tempting to miss the significance of who we are really following. But Matthew is writing to this audience and also to us. Jesus is worth following, and he's also worth staying awake for. Falling asleep on Jesus can mean a variety of things. One thing it can mean is you only call on him when you're in trouble. The moment the storm strikes is the same moment you try to get your act together and follow Jesus. Save me, I'm in trouble. And when the water grows calm, so does your discipleship. So crying out only in moments of storms is not discipleship. That's falling asleep on a man who's worth staying awake for. Or it can mean our faith isn't growing. In this passage, Jesus asked his disciples, "Why are you afraid?" Now think about it. If you were on the boat, wouldn't it have been obvious why they were afraid? I mean, look at the storm. This is why we're afraid. But shortly before getting on this boat, there's a centurion that had come to Jesus, and he's in a helpless situation. And the centurion asked Jesus to heal his servant, but you don't even need to come to my house, just say the word. And Jesus responds, "Truly I tell you, I have not found anyone in Israel with such great faith." And the disciples witness this interaction up close and personal. They see the faith of a man in a hopeless situation. And now, just a few moments later, they are in a hopeless situation. And Jesus challenges their faith. Why are you so afraid? Why do you have little faith? Didn't you learn from the centurion? I don't even have to be awake to calm the storm. If you consider yourself a mature Christian this morning, how is your faith? Is it growing? Or are you falling asleep on a man worth staying awake for? No doubt you've seen God work in your life, in the lives of other people. You've seen him work in the church. and yet you still lack faith to put God first above all in your life. Think about this. If you've had trouble with such a small thing as watching an online service from the comfort of your own couch during these last several weeks, you're definitely going to have trouble putting God first when life returns to normal. And this passage is calling you to wake up and start following Jesus again like he deserves to be followed. And sometimes waking up means renewing our decision to follow Jesus. These guys in the boat began following Jesus 4 chapters earlier. They leave everything to follow Jesus. And now their minds are completely blown because they're not even sure he's human. They had to renew and revise their thinking about Jesus. So following Jesus isn't just the initial decision, but it's constantly renewing our decisions, constantly revising our framework of who Jesus is, and constantly examining what we're attached to and what we idolize, and constantly learning and discovering more about Jesus as we follow him. When is the last time you were afraid because following Jesus meant you were way outside your comfort zone, way beyond your resources, way past relying on self? When is the last time you were amazed at the power of Jesus? Or have you fallen asleep on a man worth staying awake for? If you've been drifting recently or for a longer period of time, this passage is calling you to wake up and renew your decision and your faith about following Jesus. To conclude this morning, it's always in the midst of storms that we really begin to see the true power and the true nature of Jesus. In this passage, we see his power over storm and sickness and spirits, and we begin to realize the man we're following is the Son of God, the Creator, the Sustainer, the Redeemer, and the Restorer. What kind of man is this? He's God in the flesh, a man worth following, and a man worth fighting to stay awake for with all of our heart, all of our soul, all of our mind, and all of our strength. Let's continue following Jesus so we too can all have hope through the storm. Amen. Thanks for watching. At this time, we'll all take communion together. Let's pray. God, we are so grateful to follow someone who has power over storm and sickness and spirits, and we ask for the strength to follow you like you deserve to be followed. Thank you for your sacrifice, and we pray all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.
As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, sisters, let's go down, come on down. Oh, sisters, let's go down in the river to pray. As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the robe and crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, brothers, let's go down, come on down. Oh, brothers, let's go down in the river to pray. As I went down in the river to pray, studying about that good old way, and who shall wear the starry crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, sinners, let's go down, come on down. Oh, sinners, let's go down in the river to pray.
Thanks for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed our service. Stick around afterwards for some Zoom Room fellowship. Here's the meeting ID, which will also be displayed after our final song. See you next week.
got a hope.
I got a hope.
I gotta cry.
I got a cry.
I got love.
I got a love.
Won't let me down.
Won't let me down.
I got a hope.
I got a hope.
I gotta pride.
I got a cry.
You wipe away
You wipe away
tears from my eyes.
tears from my eyes.
In heaven, don't you know I got a home in heaven? In heaven, don't you know I got a home in heaven? I got a home
I got a hope.
forever to stay.
Forever to stay.
I've been forgiven.
I've been forgiven.
I'm on my way.
I'm on my way.
I got a hope.
I got a hope.
I got His grace.
I got His grace.
I see my Lord
I see my Lord
face to face.
face to face.
In heaven, don't you know I got a home in heaven? In heaven, don't you know I got a home in heaven? I got a home,
I got a hope.
though I once was lost.